Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to talk about the topic of emotions in our lives, what they are, their function, and their place in human society and our relationships. Additionally, how it would be helpful, in my opinion, for us all to be educated and encouraged to feel them and share them more as a means of increasing our sense of connection with each other. Expressing emotions also contributes a vital part to our overall health and well-being. Despite some of the less encouraging coverage that they've had in the past in some quarters, emotions play an important part in good mental health and can help facilitate better communication for us all. Not only that, I would go so far as to say that the healthy expression of emotions has the capacity to be a key ingredient and contributor in transforming our world in a very positive way. They are supportive of all types of relationships, whether those be romantic, families, friendships, in business, or even chance casual encounters. However, it is only relatively recently that emotion has begun to start being seen in a different light, both in the outside world as well as, perhaps more surprisingly, in the world of psychology. Before then, many people in that field largely saw them as being inconsequential or even actively unhelpful. So let's look more closely into the world of emotions and start with their function before we look at a few of what we could call the main emotions and their characteristics. The word emotion comes from the Latin word emovere, of which the greatest part means to move. Emotions move us, they stir us, they grab us, and they ask us to pay attention. Most importantly, they tell us about our most profound wants and needs, and they help direct our choices, including those we need to make to survive. When we allow ourselves to fully feel them, they also have a core part to play in organizing our internal experience and making it coherent and understandable. And the more coherent and understandable our experience is, the more reassured, secure, and confident we tend to feel. Yet emotions have often been misrepresented over time as irrational and illogical. You could say that they've had a bad press. Actually, emotions are neither irrational or illogical. Emotions are, in fact, exquisitely logical. So says Dr. Sue Johnson, the developer of emotionally focused therapy and one of the leading innovators in the field of psychotherapy. For emotions represent a vital cog in regulating our inner world. However, the more vulnerable ones have been presented historically in parts of British and some other cultures as generally needing to be avoided. And apart from anger and its variants, showing them, in particular the emotions of fear and sadness, has been cast and seen as a sign of weakness. Instead, logic, rationality, and intellectuality have become the prevailing wisdom in many areas of society, somewhat to the exclusion of the emotional part of our natures. Whilst rationality and objectivity are a vital part of human life, it's never helpful for one valuable feature to overshadow another to the extent that one is seen as the gold standard, while the other is confined to the shadows. And to a considerable extent, emotion has occupied the latter position. The attribution of weakness in showing certain emotions has been a strong cultural message that still holds true for many. It has most obviously until now lain more at the door of males and often passed down to male children as the way to be in life. And it has been and still is considered by some people to be a sign of strength not to cry or show vulnerability. While I understand that it does take effort not to cry if you're wanting to, I've always thought you could make a good case to say that it showed even greater strength to be able to cry in front of others, or show softer feelings when the considerable risk seems to be that at the very least you or others will feel exposed and embarrassed, or worse, that you'll actively be made fun of and rejected. However, the problem with holding back or repressing our emotions is that if the process is repeated sufficiently often, there is a point where it gets baked in. And if this happens, it becomes almost second nature to not only hide them, but perhaps no longer to even be aware that we're feeling them. Also, in some families, emotions are not generally expressed very much at all, or perhaps only certain specific ones are, whilst others are excluded. This modelling may then be passed on down through future generations. And so the question we might want to address as a species is it helpful for us at this time to proactively support and encourage ourselves to feel and express our emotions more? Well, for my part, I think it is, as emotions are a natural part of our internal world and play an important and useful role in our society interactions and relationships with each other. While anger and its variations seem to have been the one emotion that has been more widely expressed, we do seem to be seeing the beginnings of a steady sea change publicly towards a more general acknowledgement of the other more vulnerable emotions, and in particular fear and sadness. A gradual opening up for it becoming increasingly acceptable for men, and indeed all of us, to talk about, indicate, and even show these softer feelings. Mental health is a phrase that it's difficult now not to bump into, perhaps even on a daily basis. In other words, the growing recognition and statement of the obvious, that the inner world of our minds plays a vital part in each and every human life. And much needed encouragement for us all to become more aware of what does constitute good mental health. So now I'd like to talk in a bit more detail about 4 of the main emotions, and these are fear, sadness, shame, and anger. Let's start with fear. Some associated words include panic, anxiety, worry, and apprehension. In many senses, fear is the primary emotion that is the most frequently felt and fundamental to all our existences. Its purpose is to alert us to appraise our safety in the presence of what is or might be a perceived threat. Is that slim, dark piece of wood sitting in the heather just a piece of wood, or a snake basking in the sun? If it's a threat, to be able to decide whether we need to face it or avoid it. In other words, it invokes our fight or flight response. And not surprisingly, we tend to avoid feeling fear because the sensation is very unpleasant and we tend to feel vulnerable and somewhat helpless in its presence. Interestingly, in talking about fear and its role, this is where I want to slot in a second emotion, and that's anger. Because invariably anger goes hand in hand with fear. Some associated words for this emotion are annoyance, frustration, impatience, and irritation. Anger and fear are undoubtedly frequent bedfellows without it being necessarily obvious to the eye, but they have very different qualities and sensations attached to us feeling them. Anger is active, assertive, and is involved in doing. It empowers us, and its sensation acts as an antidote to feeling vulnerable and helpless. And therefore, in that sense, anger can feel protective. It tends to push others away. Its action and message is one that largely says, watch out, I'm not happy, back off, and if you keep coming, it's like to not go well for you. I've thought about this quite a lot, but I'm not sure that I've ever in my whole life, well, maybe once, but only once, experienced anger without being able to see eventually that it is somehow connected to and follows from having some fear underneath. Therefore, you might be forgiven for thinking that anger almost seems to act like an agent on behalf of fear, whether that's an accurate characterization or not. It's not always easy to distinguish the fear or feel it immediately, but it is usually somewhere there. We might actually need some time to go by and the anger to run its course before we might become aware of the fear. One exception from life that does perhaps allow us to identify more easily the relationship between this duo at close range is when a child's safety is threatened by running out into the road. In order to protect the child, a parent often acts quickly and sometimes roughly and might shout or admonish the child. If the child starts crying, the parent might sometimes say something like, "I was only angry because I was scared." But seeing the fear under the anger more immediately is more the exception rather than the rule. Anger is obviously useful if we need to assert ourselves or stand our ground in presence of a threat or danger. It is a valid and an important emotion in its own right, and has an intrinsic purpose like all emotions when it is felt and expressed and is allowed to run its course. But it can become a problem for us in our interpersonal relationships with each other and for society as a whole when we only get angry and are not able to feel and show the fear, sadness, or shame that may be sitting underneath. So if that's anger, let's move now to our third emotion, and that's sadness. And here there are associating words like disappointment, sorrow, and regret with this very important main emotion. Sadness is, of course, associated often with loss and grieving, and therefore can feel potent and enduring in length when it's associated, for example, with a recent bereavement or loss of a relationship. We may be prone to, or finding ourselves crying or weeping when we feel this emotion strongly, and it has a very vulnerable feeling that goes with experiencing it, that can also invoke feeling helpless and cause us to want to hide it. I think it's a very important emotion for the human race, as when we allow ourselves to feel it and express it fully, sadness keeps us close to and in touch with our humanity, and has a deeply cleansing quality. It brings with it a softness that is wonderful, intrinsic, and vital, and helps balance us. And if we repress it, like fear, it often lies under and can give rise to anger, as well as being thought to be involved in some forms of depression. So our fourth and final emotion that I want to mention today is shame. Some associated words on the same continuum are worthlessness, humiliation, inadequacy, guilt, and embarrassment. They all carry a similar, or at least a significant degree of discomfort. This emotion warrants, in my view, a little more caution and understanding of its characteristics. In my opinion, if there is a collective wound in the psyche of the human race that we show to each other on a regular basis, then I would say that this emotion demonstrates itself to be the leading contender. This is shown by how easily and prone we all are to the sudden pain of feeling criticized and inadequate. Never far away, always just under the surface and ready to reveal itself. This emotion is probably in many ways the most difficult emotion to feel because it does most intensely challenge our sense of self, our sense of self-worth, indeed. To swim in shame and stay any length of time directly in contact with it can be said to be toxic to the human experience and is not helpful, particularly if we feel we have little or no protection from it or we experience it on our own. When we feel it, we frequently feel the need to protect ourselves and hide because it makes us feel so exposed, raw, and vulnerable if we get too close or caught up in it. So it is best to perhaps feel its presence from what we might call a safe enough distance. Yes, to be aware and to be able to acknowledge its presence and message to us inside, but not to feel overwhelmed by it. That's not helpful, and we may need support if we experience that happening, including reaching out to other people. Okay, so that's a whistle-stop tour around the qualities and characteristics of some of the main emotions. Let's now look at why I'm saying that it will be helpful and healthy for us all to express our emotions more and in a way that benefits us individually as well as all human society. Initially, I think there are two compelling reasons that strike me. One is that it's natural and serves a biological need to have emotion and allow ourselves to feel emotions as part of our response to life. That when we feel them, and if we allow ourselves to feel them fully and express them safely to ourselves and others, they are a very useful and natural expression of our life force. Once we allow ourselves to fully feel them, let them run their course and deliver their message, as you could describe it, then we can experience ourselves returning to a more normal resting state and homeostasis. Just like a muscle that turns on in some physical movement, and when that's completed, turns back off. That it makes sense that fully feeling our emotions is likely to promote and support more optimal functioning of our physical health. And furthermore, that emotions act as a conduit for facilitating good human relationships. And with good relationships come good connection, and with good connection comes the foundation of any healthy society and all that flows from that. And a healthily functioning society can't do without good emotional and relational connection amongst its members. Also, it cannot flourish without the ability for all of us to have access to and understand the tools needed to repair when we do get emotionally disconnected from each other. We all know you can't avoid getting disconnected regularly from other human beings in both minor and major ways. It's kind of happening all the time, isn't it, to us all on virtually a daily basis, often in the blink of an eye and often when we don't intend it, expect it, or want it. But the key thing is knowing what to do when we do get triggered by something and that connection with another person suddenly evaporates and we want it back. And being able to risk expressing our vulnerable emotions is an important part of a toolkit that helps us do that. So what tells me that emotions are so important to us all and that they act as a means of facilitating all human relationships? Well, I would say that my work with couples tells me so. And here I want to mention Dr. Sue Johnson again and her gift to the world of emotionally focused therapy. Emotionally focused therapy is not only used for couples, but it's also used in individual therapy and with family therapy as well. Sue has helped us understand the vital importance of our collective human need for bonding and the key role of safely expressing vulnerable emotion in re-establishing connection when we lose it. In order for us to be able to do that at the level of a species, it's going to involve a collective effort by us all. In addition to the general trend that has begun, that sees more individuals starting to speak about and show their vulnerable emotion, this also, in my view, needs to be supported by a proactive message that comes from other stakeholders in society. As I mentioned in my opening video of The Elephant in the Room, a major source surely has to be mainstream education, supported by the world of psychology and allied professions, and the use of the internet as a further means of education and global reach. So, by these routes and the action of osmosis, do I feel confident that emotion will steadily reverse its fortunes and be seen increasingly as a natural, helpful, and vital part of human society. That's all for today. Next time I'll start taking a first look at verbal communication. Thank you for watching, and please hit the subscribe button so that you can be made aware as soon as a new video comes out. And if you have enjoyed it, do let others know about the channel.